S-150, Senator Feinstein.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for allowing me to hold the hearing. I want to just report to you that we heard from one bereft and grieving father who lost a precious son at Sandy Hook. We heard from the trauma surgeon there who took care of their bodies and talked about what these weapons with the bullets do when they explode inside the body. We heard from the head of the United States Conference of Mayors, Mayor Nutter of Philadelphia, who assured us of their support. We heard from Chief Flynn of Baltimore, who assured us of the support of the chiefs and talked about his city. I want to acknowledge the presence of Chief Johnson of the Baltimore County Police Departments here. We had a demonstration of a slide fire stock placed in an AR-15, which was able to alternate the gun between semi-automatic and fully automatic fire. Excuse me, let me correct it. Chief Flynn is from Milwaukee. I've been very concerned because the calls have been coming in as if this is some kind of wild-eyed scheme. It is not. Every single poll that has been done in the United States has shown that a majority of people favor this legislation. We have endorsements from virtually every religious organization, every medical organization, mayors, police, women's movement, supporting this legislation. And yet it's as if we have a minority, unsubstantial piece of legislation. Whether it's a Johns Hopkins poll of 69%, mayors against illegal guns at 81%, it's been a very hard row. Secondly, there's been the argument by the opposition that this measure is unconstitutional. I deeply believe that it is not unconstitutional. It is basically formed from the prior legislation which survived tests in the 4th, in the 6th, in the 9th Circuit, and the D.C. Circuit. No assault weapons legislation statewide in this country ever has been found unconstitutional. And the Heller decision clearly stated, and I quote, "The right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited," end quote. And, quote, "dangerous and unusual weapons," quote, "could be prohibited." Since Heller, state assault weapons, as I said, have been upheld, and no court that I'm aware of has ever found an assault weapons ban to be unconstitutional. Over 50 distinguished constitutional law professors, including conservatives and libertarians, from our nation's leading law schools, including Harvard, Stanford, Yale, and Chicago, signed a statement confirming that an assault weapons ban is constitutional. I particularly want to thank the co-sponsors on this committee. I want to acknowledge the long-standing support of the man who presented the ban in the House of Representatives over 10 years ago, the distinguished senator from New York. I want to point out that Senator Durbin's support in the committee was really strong and appreciated. And I want to thank virtually all of the other co-sponsors in this room. I want to just point out that I carefully watched Senator Blumenthal, excuse me. I saw his care. I saw his, and Senator Murphy too, his representation of that deeply affected community in Connecticut. And I just want you to know I have my deepest respect goes to you for what has been a very hard venture. And I'm particularly grateful for your support of this legislation. Now, what does this legislation do? It bans specific assault weapons by name, 157 in this instance. It protects the rights of gun owners to possess weapons for legitimate hunting and sporting and defense uses by excluding many more weapons by make and model, over 2,000 of them. It grandfathers all present weapons. If they are transferred, it subjects the transferee to a background test. It does not require registration. It applies a military characteristics test to judge future weapons to prevent gun manufacturers from evading the ban by simply changing the name of the weapon or a physical characteristic of the weapon. We tried to learn from the last bill and refine this bill to avoid the problems of gun manufacturers simply getting around the bill. The features that we use were originally developed for military weapons for one reason: to make the weapon more effective and efficient at killing people in combat situations. As Chief Flynn of the Milwaukee Police Department testified last week, and I quote, "Assault weapons are built to inflict violence against humans. Their military characteristics are not simply cosmetic in nature. These weapons are designed for combat." You know, I've watched even police departments get outgunned. In the 9 years I was mayor of San Francisco, we started out with police issue being a .38 caliber revolver. We've seen that escalate. We've seen shotguns be removed from squad cars and replaced with assault weapons. Why? Because of an increasingly armed criminal element that police often have to go up against. I watched as the Los Angeles Police Department had to break into a gun store to take weapons to be able to counter what was going up against them following a robbery in Los Angeles. I don't know why anyone would object to drying up the supply of these weapons over time. They are not good hunting weapons. Many states have limits on the number of bullets that can be on a clip. And who's going to respect a hunter with a 30-round clip and an assault weapon going after a deer? I certainly am not one that would. So the intention of this is to dry up the supply over time. While homicides in general are down in this country, mass killings are not. And the fact is that these assault weapons have a great attraction for grievance killers. The people that go into law offices, as they did in San Francisco, and shoot down 14 people. The man who went into the Aurora Theater just to kill people with a 100-round drum in an assault weapons. And we've seen it in universities, we've seen them in elementary schools, and now we have seen them used against first graders. The time has come, America, to step up and ban these weapons. The other very important part of this bill is to ban large capacity ammunition feeding devices, those that hold over 10 rounds. We have federal regulations and state laws that prohibit hunting ducks with more than 3 rounds, and yet it's legal to hunt humans with 15-round, 30-round, even 150-round magazines. Limiting magazine capacity is critical because it is when a criminal, a drug dealer, a deranged individual has to pause to change magazines and reload that the police or brave bystanders have the opportunity to take that individual down. We saw this scenario happen in Tucson, Arizona, where the madman who shot our former colleague, Gabby Giffords, was taken down when he had to change magazines. So my view is that how could I stand by and see this carnage go on? And members, this isn't going to stop. It's going to continue on. And we have a chance to do something about it. So I cannot tell you how much. I was mayor of San Francisco for 9 years. I walked into places, I saw the carnage firsthand. And at that time, I really dedicated the rest of my life to do something about it. So this is an opportunity. I want to thank those who are with me. I don't know that I can convince those that are not, but I intend to keep trying. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Do you have any amendment to your amendment?
I do not.
Are there amendments to Senator Feinstein's? Sure. So first I said Grassley first. Sorry, I was going to you too. I appreciate Senator Feinstein's sincerity. I expressed that 3 or 4 times at the last hearing. I suppose as much as I oppose her bill, she wonders whether I appreciate her sincerity or not. This has been an important issue for her for 20 years, and we all have to feel for the victims of Newtown. But there are other parents of children who were killed at Sandy Hook Elementary School who mourn the loss of their loved ones, no less, and yet feel very differently about the ways Congress should respond. On Tuesday, I spoke to Mr. Matt Eoli. His son James was one of those victims. Even in his grief, he sent me a letter that he authorized me to seek consent to place on the record in a quote during the debate. Mr. Matt Eoli describes how no one should have to endure what he has endured, and of course no one should. He wrote, quote, "I can understand where knee-jerk reactions come from to ensure never again. I caution that we employ common sense and do not hand over any liberty which is protected by the Constitution," end of quote. I agree. We continue to wait for the Justice Department constitutional analysis of the bill, despite statements by the Department Justice witness at 2 hearings on this matter. I have yet to see an opinion from the department arguing that this bill is constitutional. I appreciate the input of other scholars who have offered their opinions as witnesses, but the Justice Department has or should have a different role in providing us with a constitutional analysis. I go back to Mr. Matt Eoli saying that the debate should not be about controlling guns, but controlling people who cannot control themselves, like people with mental illness and felonies. He favors making sure people can find their moral compass and parents who will raise their children to know right from wrong and not expose them to violence. I agree with Mr. Mattingly on this point. Then he writes, quote, "For those who tell me that my son and 25 others were killed that day with an assault weapon, I challenge them to consider," end of his quote, "other important factors." He says that assault weapons, quote, "are not a threat to our safety," end of quote, and he's very focused on improving mental health services. Mr. Mattingly also opposes the limit on magazine capacities. He asks, quote, "With 250 million guns in the United States, how are you going to make me safer by reducing new magazines to 1, 5, or 10 rounds? Question mark. He continues to say, "You will not increase my safety, only obstruct me from protecting myself from criminals who may possess one of the existing guns out there," end of quote. Mr. Matt Eoli has great courage to have survived this terrible ordeal and to make the statements he has made. I think he speaks with great understanding of how to address mass shootings. His words, difficult to write, I'm sure, are important viewpoint that we should consider. This is especially true when the constitutional concerns about this legislation that arrive in light of the Heller decision. I continue to believe that this legislation is flawed under the Supreme Court's Second Amendment cases. Given those flaws, I oppose the legislation. Thank you. I yield the floor. Thank you very much. I'll try to go back and forth here. Anybody seeking here?
Mr. Chairman,
I
want to begin by thanking the chairman for his leadership on the illegal trafficking.
the microphone on.
I want to begin by thanking the chairman for his leadership on the illegal trafficking bill and commend him and my fellow co-sponsors, and thank Senator Feinstein for her very kind comments, but most especially for her leadership on this bill. The plain, simple, blunt fact is that some, if not all, of the beautiful children who perished that day in Newtown, along with the great educators who gave their lives trying to save those children, might well be alive today if this ban had been in effect. A ban on these military-style assault weapons and the high-capacity magazines. As Senator Feinstein has already told the committee, we heard testimony from Captain Mark Kelly, who recounted what happened in Tucson that day when the shooter had to change magazines. And Christina Taylor, a 9-year-old who perished that day from the 13th bullet fired, probably would be alive if the magazine used by the shooter had been limited to 10 rounds. The same is true in Newtown, where children were able to escape because the shooter had to change magazines on that day. More than 10 children are alive today because of his need to change magazines, and more would be if his magazine had been limited to 10 rounds, as her legislation would do. So I recognize that there are concerns about it. We've heard them. The overwhelming majority of the American people are in favor of this legislation, and the opponents failed to reflect the concern that goes beyond Newtown, but certainly Newtown is a call to action. It has created a sense of urgency that Americans feel, and I hope the committee will reflect that sense of urgency in approving this legislation.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to start by saying I agree with Senator Grassley that sometimes Congress tries to impose from Washington, D.C., a one-size-fits-all proposed solution that really is best left to localities and states. It's become clear to me, if it wasn't clear before, that there are cultural differences in America between those people who have grown up with guns and know how to use them. They're comfortable with them. They use them safely for hunting or recreation or self-defense. And then there are other people who are scared by guns because they've never been around one. And perhaps they live in an urban area where the only gun they ever see or hear of is one in the hands of someone committing a crime. So I think first of all, I would just say that an attempt to legislate for the entire United States in a one-size-fits-all proposal is a mistake. And I would say that this is not a ban on weapons. The senator from California, who I have great admiration and respect and affection for, acknowledged that this legislation does nothing to deal with the fact that many of these weapons, which will now be outlawed prospectively, are already in the hands of American citizens, law-abiding American citizens. So it is not a ban. It also is not what it is. What it does impact are semi-automatic rifles. Now, you can call it an assault weapon because it looks, for cosmetic purposes, it looks scary to people who are not familiar with them. But the fact of the matter is these are semi-automatic rifles. And this bill does nothing to deal with semi-automatic handguns. I'm not advocating that it should. I'm just pointing out that it is not going to achieve the goals that the sponsors believe it will. And I believe that one of the biggest problems we have in the country is the lack of enforcement by the Department of Justice of current laws. I mean, we all support keeping straw purchasers from buying weapons and directing them to people who can't legally own them or possess them. We all believe that mental health
ought to be a focus of our efforts here, and this bill does nothing to deal with that. And we all wonder why it is the Department of Justice won't prosecute people who lie on background checks. Well, I think they told us that because they don't deem them a sufficient priority to do so. But I guess we ought to ask the question: why are we? What is there that we might be able to do to address the non-enforcement of current laws as opposed to passing new laws? Of course, Congress and President Clinton tried a so-called assault weapons ban 19 years ago, and we have the benefit of hindsight as well as some research to examine the lackluster results of that decade-long experiment. According to the Department of Justice's own study, it was completely ineffectual in reducing murder or violent crime rates. Now, some have talked about this 1997 study funded by the Justice Department and claimed that it reduced gun murders by 6.7%. But the problem with that claim is the study reveals in the next sentence how weak the evidence really was. The authors said in the next sentence, however, the evidence is not strong enough for us to conclude there was any meaningful effect, i.e. that the effect was different from zero. So are we really going to pass another law that will have zero effect and pat ourselves on the back and say we've accomplished something wonderful? Well, we tried this experiment once and it failed, and I think it promotes symbolism over seriousness to repeat that mistake. A real concern of mine is that the efforts to enact this gun ban are distracting Congress from working on areas that I believe there is a broad consensus in keeping deranged madmen from buying guns. If there was a common thread in the Virginia Tech, Tucson, and Aurora and Newtown massacres, it was the mental illness of the shooter. This bill does nothing to deal with that. The commonality is not the type of guns used. Some use pistols, some use rifles, and at least 2 shotguns were found at the scene of these crimes. The common thread was mental illness. No one wants disturbed young men, or women for that matter, to have access to firearms. Unfortunately, this legislation focuses not on the perilous intersection of mental illness and guns, but on cosmetic features of certain firearms. We should refocus our effort to make sure the current background check system works to screen out the dangerously mentally ill. Now, I'm encouraged that some, including Senator Graham, have proposed legislation suggesting methods to patch the holes in the background check system that enable the mentally ill to buy guns. That's the type of legislation that would bring a consensus, that would be a real solution to a real problem. But sadly, we seem to be focused on window dressing and risk putting symbolism over substance.